Well, clearly, critics become significant to filmmakers when we're getting close to the completion of the movie. I remember when I was working with David Putnam many years ago, there used to be a lot more interaction earlier on between some of the key critics. So they would have the privilege of understanding what was on its way, if you see what I mean. And I think that doesn't happen now, or if it does, very rare. And I think that would be a good thing to see happening. So that I do believe that there should be a greater interaction between critics and filmmakers.
Sorry, I mean, when you say that in the days when you were working with David Putnam that there was interaction with certain key critics, do you mean that they had advanced access to footage, or they were on set?
They would come to set perhaps, or come and have a look at an early cut. And so it had a double-edged benefit. It gave them a heads up about where this was heading to and what to expect, and it gave the filmmakers a critical, independent eye to look at things and to give a view. So there is a natural symbiosis between critics and filmmakers, which at the moment seems to have slightly separated. I mean, there's an argument to say that they should not know the processes of filmmaking, and simply assess the film on its merits once it's completed. Having said that, I think the great critics of the past, the Pauline Kaels and the Dilys Powells, they understood the processes of filmmaking, particularly the creative processes, enough to understand what had been attempted. Because very often the ignorance of critics is a problem for filmmakers. We need critics to understand what has taken place to get to that point, but not to be thwarted by it in any way.
Okay. What, if any, impact do critics have on the actual filmmaking business?
Well, critics can damage the sensitivity of filmmakers. They can if they misbehave, let's say, they can drive filmmakers into more safe territory, where they don't make so many mistakes, and I think that's a very regrettable situation, because of course that's what the big corporations want as well. So it tends to make for risk-averse filmmaking. I think risk taking in the movie business should pretty well always be acknowledged, at least, if not rewarded, because without that you really do have a pretty mediocre slate.
What good or bad can critics do to a film?
I don't think critics can harm the film itself. It is what it is by the time they hold sway over it. But certainly they can damage the box office. They can discourage people from going to see it. Although increasingly I would say there are signs that, both good and bad, that whatever critics say doesn't actually have much impact on box office for the larger films. With Mad Max, for instance, the good reviews from critics have still not carried it to the place that Jurassic World has got to. So there's something else going on at that level. But where I think critics could have a very important influence is on the independent films and on emerging talent.
So just drawing the public's attention to films that otherwise aren't going to get the kind of promotion that a Jurassic World gets.
Absolutely, and the self-promotion. I mean, the bow wave of something like Jurassic World is huge by Twitterdom and the social network. Whereas independent films, it's increasingly hard to be even noticed, no matter how good or bad they are. And I think it's a duty on the realm of criticdom to make that better.
Are there any typical, let's say, mistakes made by critics that really get on your nerves? And you can be as general or as specific as you like here. and how it's a kind of double-edged question. It's a two-part question, but how do you think that such mistakes might be improved? Like, how could the critical community improve its act?
Well, I would like to see more generalized interaction between critics and filmmakers, simply to discuss the mediums that they're involved in. I think where critics could be faulted, I think there can be fault on both sides here. I'm not defending one against the other. But I think where critics could perhaps take more care is on differentiating between those films that have been made cynically and are simply commercial exercises, and those films where someone has put their heart and soul into it but hasn't quite got there. And it comes back to this thing of encouraging risk and encouraging innovation and originality. If we don't have that, then we'll end up with a very dry bed of stuff.
And well, I'm not asking you to name names or anything, but do you think there are some critics that you would champion as the people that do reward
Oh yes, there are what I would call, to be lazy about it, intelligent critics who are aware of more than just simply the screen in front of them. I could name a few, but that would probably be unfair, because I can also name people that I'm infuriated by and who consistently are lazy in their assessment of the work.
It's entirely up to you whether you name or not. You're most welcome to do so, but you might not wish
to. I have to
yeah.
maintain relationships.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I completely understand. Does film criticism have anything positive to contribute to the industry, or is film criticism really just for readers and film goers?
I think it doesn't have as much to contribute to the film industry as it should. And so the answer to that question is absolutely yes. The film industry needs good critical assessment of the work that's done. One of the difficulties, of course, is that the business has become more and more international. So where before you had a definable British film industry, that's a little less easy to define these days. But I do think that filmmakers need to have critical environment within which to think and work just as much as they need a commercial environment. And I think in Britain we suffer a little bit from that.
What from a professional, but perhaps also from a kind of personal standpoint, would you like to see in the film criticism that you read? Like, what do you consider to be good film criticism?
One of the most important aspects of making films is much less the technology and the celebrity, etc. Is the importance of the archetypal story that drives the whole thing. And I'm always looking to see if the critic has grasped that subtext within. There have been some excellent criticisms of Fury Road, for instance. I mean, deeply analytical and not for everybody, but I've appreciated them because they have actually amazingly grasped things that I thought nobody would ever really understand. So that's my own thing. I think from a wider point of view, wider perspective, I think it's important that they enable people to understand not only the movie is good, okay, fine, the movie's good, or the movie's bad, but in what context, how does it fit into a wider canon? Is this film significant in the sense that it arises from something else? Does this continue in the vein of the cinema of the 60s, Godard or whatever, or as with Mad Max, what is the linkage between Fury Road and the great silent movies of Erich von Stroheim and Griffith and Keaton? So those, I think, putting the film in context within a larger historical canon, I think is also something I like to read.
Thank you very much. From your perspective, is there any difference between professional and amateur critics? I mean, by which I strictly mean paid and unpaid. And also between print and online. Do these categories make any difference to you?
Well, I think we're in an interesting place with social networking, because clearly one of the big influencers now is non-professional criticism, which is equivalent to word of mouth, but it's just been accelerated by social networking. And I think there's, whether I like it or not, I think that's an inevitable and powerful thing. I mean, again, Fury Road has been picked up by word of mouth, and that's keeping it up in the cinemas, which is a blessing. Having said that, as with any other walk of life, I think professionalised content is still demanded by a large section of the networking public. And I certainly would be very sad to see that go. I'm very worried literally worried, about the number of film reviewers and critics that I know who are now being expected to write for no pay. And I think that's an extremely bad turn of events, as it is in any other walk of life. But I think professional in the sense that not just that they've been paid, but they take their work seriously as professionals is very, very important.
With the advent of the World Wide Web and social media, the sort of the rise of the online world that we all live in now, there's never been more chatter about films, often starting long before the first scene of a film has even been shot, before production has really started. Do you see much difference between this, let's call it random online noise, maybe it's not random, and the arguably more kind of considered voice of critics, arguably more considered, which is better for business?
I think without any doubt the sort of or disorganized chatter online is probably at the end of the day more important for business than professionalized content, simply because more and more people will believe it. Unfortunately, major corporations and studios will tend to publicize something regardless of its merit. And so the consumer distrusts that. So paid advertising in the conventional sense is not trusted as much as it once was. And now I think people, and myself included, I'm more likely to go on to Twitter or Facebook or whatever to get a sense, a feel for what the wider population is saying. That's very, very useful. In terms of critics, I do think they serve a very, very important function, but increasingly they're being read by lesser and lesser people, and I think that's not a good thing at all. I do
wonder whether, this might be a false perception on my part, but the impression that I get about what has come hand in hand with the rise of the internet is that we really do hear a lot more about films before they're made. It's true that there's far more voices you're going to hear after a film. There's far more opinion to which we all have access after the film. But I'm now talking before the production is on. Even sometimes before a film is shot, before a scene is shot, people will be commenting on, they can't do this, how dare they do that, this is a story I'm already anchored to and I don't like the treatment they're doing, how dare they cast that actor. Does this sort of, in a sense this is getting away from film criticism, but I wonder, does that affect production? Is there a feedback system here where a production actually pays attention to what people are saying about the production before it happens? Well,
I think that sort of phenomenon happens more where you're dealing with a franchise, obviously, right. Where there's an expectation on the part of an audience. It's much less the case, obviously, when a film has not been prefaced in any way. I haven't heard of any case ever in film where the content of the film has been changed because of public opinions, unless, I guess, if they were absolutely 100%. We don't want Idris Elba to play James Bond, for instance. I dare say that Michael and Barbara probably take that into account to some extent. I don't know. They shouldn't, but because the voice of the public doesn't mean to say it's correct or right. Where I do think there is a bit of a crossover is in active, generally American television. I produced 24 when it was here in London, and that was a kind of interactive process with the television audience. And again, fairly blunt. It wouldn't change specifics, but generally one likes to feel your marketplace. It can be quite useful.
But so on the whole, would you say that this kind of, let's call it Twitter chat, is something that doesn't really impact in any way on an actual production? It's just noise that's out there. It might impact on reception, but it's not going to affect the actual what happens.
No, I think content, especially on film, content, once we're underway and the financing's in place and the casting is done and we've started to make the production, it would take a lot to change that.
Do you think that this sort of pre-film chatter is something that it's not just something in which the general public likes to engage, but it's also something in which the critical community quite actively engages on Twitter? And I wonder if you think that represents I mean, are you fine with that, or is that something that you think is a kind of abrogation of their kind of ethical responsibility?
I'm fine with it in as much as I can't be anything else. I do think critics should remain at some kind of a professional and intellectual distance. Not to say they should be remote, but they shouldn't be swimming around in the mud, or the boo, as the French would call it. And I think they can understand it and be sensitive to it, just as we would be sensitive to it. But I do think critics have to maintain, as filmmakers do. I mean, if we were just simply to abrogate our responsibilities to creativity, originality, innovation, then it would be a pretty sad business. And the thing that really people love is where a movie takes them by surprise. And I think it was Arthur Miller who famously said, give the audience what they want, but in a way they least expect. So that originality comes from people taking risks, from people not being swayed by the popular voice, but being sensitive to it.
For my last question, I'm gonna talk about a film that I have no axe to grind here, because it's not a film I've seen. I'm just talking about it because it's a very concrete example of something I want to ask about. I don't have an opinion on the film because I haven't seen it, but with the imminent release of Terminator Genesis, so a franchise film, the director of the first two Terminator films, James Cameron, has made a very public statement advocating for the film and giving his blessing, and that statement, which was filmed and recorded, and very professionally recorded, has become part of the marketing campaign for the film. It's actually incorporated in the ads that are on television. What I wonder is, do you see this as a kind of a healthy alternative to the more traditional kind of quotes on the poster from a critic that we'd see? Or, I mean, is it okay for a director?
I think it's very good that James Cameron has come out like that and said this. I'm pretty sure that he's doing it because he does believe that the movie is supportable by him. I think if he felt it was a train crash, he probably wouldn't do that. So that's a positive sign, and people read that. They read that if he's prepared to stick his neck out and say that, then this is probably a movie worth 10 quid to go and see. Having said that, no one should ever lose sight of the fact that these movies are big commercial enterprises. They're high-risk investments made for high-risk reward, and James Cameron is part of that system as much as anything. But he's sufficiently self-respecting as a creator to make his statement worth taking seriously.
Thank you. I think I have no further questions. But that said, I'm sure that there are lots of issues that you possibly feel we haven't addressed. So if there's anything else,
I mean, one thing I would say about to critics is, and I guess to filmmakers, is we all have to remember that in the best of senses, we are all part of the same business. And that's not to say that critics should just willy-nilly promote films, but I think it's very important for the film business to be protected in its entirety, which, and I certainly have experienced it myself, where critics have just taken a cheap shot at a movie. And obviously, in my opinion, unjustifiably. And I think that in the long term is a very short-sighted way to play things. So the more the critics and filmmakers can perceive that we're all part of the same wonderful, amazing business, the better.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we're all coming at this from a love of cinema, and we all
Absolutely.
think cinema is a great thing.
Absolutely. So, I love it when I go to a critic's screening of someone else's film, and I see all these kind of slightly nutty people, they're as nutty as I am. As I said to the school kids a week ago, I said, filmmaking is a kind of disease. If you either have it or you don't, and if you have it, then that you're going to be a slave to that all your life. You're going to make films as I've done. I started making films when I was 11. And criticism is the same. Criticism is when people see movies and fall in love and it takes them over. And it's amazing to see these people. I love it. I think it's one of the most amazing audiences to be part of.
and also generally a quieter audience than you find in cinemas today.
Quieter, unless it's absolutely atrocious, in which case. And also in America, you get a different. I mean, the Hollywood Foreign Press, for instance, is a very different feel to the way they watch movies to a British.
How so?
Well, they're more expressive. I mean, you generally get more commentary going on, even with things that they're liking. So there tends to be a bit more noise in the room, as with American audiences. When you're testing a film, American audiences are usually pretty vocal. The opposite is true in Britain. And the American filmmakers who come over to Britain to test their films are very worried by the audience's silence. And we have to say, no, that's okay, that's a cultural norm. That's good, you know. In America, if the audience was silent, it would mean it's bad.
Right.
So that used to be the case anyway. So I mean, you're dealing with all sorts of different cultural interfacings. But no, I think we couldn't do our business without critics, and critics couldn't do their business without films.
We would have nothing to do without films.
So you know, let's be united in that.
It's funny that you say that you know, once you have this bug, you can't you know, you're stuck with it, because it's I mean, I do think actually it's a problem for film critics in that you know, you mentioned that increasingly, particularly freelance critics are finding that they're being expected to work for free, and the problem is we all have this compulsion, and so therefore we do work for free because we want to keep working.
Yes.
And that's a real problem actually. But
well, it's equivalent, I think, to the situation in nursing, for instance, where nurses are very often driven vocationally, and they want to care. It's in their DNA, and are exploited as such. And I think we are in that. You know, we're a want business, not a need business, and so being a want business is tricky. It puts us in a difficult place.